Every evening at exactly 6 p.m., Thomas Brennan would walk the streets of Millbrook with his ladder and oil can, lighting the town's street lamps one by one. But what the townspeople didn't know was that Thomas wasn't bringing light to their streets. He was creating a secret language of darkness that guided escaped prisoners to freedom, and the night his carefully planned lighting pattern was discovered by the wrong people, it nearly cost him everything. But to understand how a simple lamplighter became the most wanted man in Colorado territory, we need to go back to where it all started. Back to a spring evening in 1874, when young Thomas first learned that some lights are meant to guide people toward freedom, and some shadows are more valuable than the brightest flame. Thomas Brennan had arrived in Millbrook, Colorado territory, in the spring of 1874 as a 31-year-old former Union Army Signal Corps operator, carrying with him specialized knowledge of communication systems that would prove invaluable in a frontier town where information could mean the difference between life and death. He was unremarkable in appearance. Average height, brown hair that was already thinning at the temples, and the kind of forgettable face that allowed him to blend into crowds without attracting attention, a characteristic that would become essential to his secret mission. Millbrook in 1874 was a rapidly growing cattle town that served as a major stopping point for trail drives heading north from Texas to the railroad terminals in Kansas and Colorado. The town's population swelled from fewer than 800 permanent residents to over 3,000 during peak cattle season, creating a chaotic environment where strangers were common. Law enforcement was stretched thin, and criminal activities flourished under the cover of legitimate commerce. The town's layout was typical of frontier cattle towns, with a main street running east to west that was lined with saloons, hotels, general stores, and businesses that catered to cowboys and cattle drivers. Side streets branched off from a main thoroughfare, leading to residential areas where permanent residents lived and worked. The entire community was connected by a network of oil-burning street lamps that had been installed the previous year as part of an ambitious modernization project funded by wealthy cattle barons who wanted to project an image of civilization and progress. Thomas had been hired as Millbrook's first official lamplighter, a position that had been created when the town council realized that maintaining the street lighting system required specialized knowledge and daily attention. His job was simple in concept but complex in execution. Every evening, he would walk a predetermined route through the town, lighting each street lamp with oil and adjusting the wicks to ensure consistent illumination throughout the night. Every morning, he would reverse the process, extinguishing the lamps and performing maintenance to keep the system functioning properly. But Thomas's true purpose in Millbrook had nothing to do with street lighting. He was actually an operative working for a secret network of former Union Army intelligence personnel who had dedicated their post-war lives to combating the criminal organizations that had emerged throughout the frontier territories. These networks included Confederate veterans who had turned to banditry, corrupt territorial officials who exploited their positions for personal gain, and organized criminal enterprises that preyed on the chaos and isolation of frontier communities. The specific mission that had brought Thomas to Millbrook was the investigation and disruption of a sophisticated prisoner transport operation that was being conducted by a criminal network with connections to corrupt territorial authorities. The operation involved the illegal capture and transportation of various categories of people who were valuable for different reasons. Former slaves who were being returned to bondage in violation of federal law, political dissidents who were being silenced by powerful interests, witnesses to serious crimes who were being prevented from testifying, and immigrants who were being exploited through various forms of involuntary servitude. The criminal network had chosen Millbrook as a major transit point for their prisoner transport operation because the town's location on major cattle trails provided perfect cover for moving large numbers of people without attracting attention. Captives would be disguised as cattle drivers, ranch hands, or other legitimate travelers, then transported through the town during the busy cattle season when the streets were crowded with strangers and local authorities were too overwhelmed to conduct thorough investigations of everyone passing through. Thomas's assignment was to identify the methods being used by the criminal network, document their operations, and develop strategies for disrupting their activities without alerting them to the fact that they were under investigation. His cover as a lamplighter was perfect for this mission because it gave him legitimate reasons to be on the streets at all hours, observing activities and noting patterns that would be invisible to casual observers. The lamp lighting system that Thomas had been hired to maintain actually provided him with unprecedented surveillance capabilities. His daily routes took him past every major building, street corner, and gathering place in Millbrook, allowing him to observe activities throughout the community. His work schedule required him to be active during the evening hours when most criminal activities took place. Most importantly, his position gave him access to elevated vantage points through his use of ladders, enabling him to see over walls, into yards, and through windows that would be invisible from street level. But Thomas's greatest innovation was his transformation of the street lighting system itself into a communication network that could be used to coordinate rescue operations and guide escaped prisoners to safety. By developing a complex system of lighting patterns, he could send detailed messages to network operatives throughout the town without using written communications that could be intercepted or verbal conversations that could be overheard. The communication system that Thomas developed was based on the military signal protocols he had learned during his service in the Union Army Signal Corps, but adapted for the specific requirements of covert operations in a civilian environment. Different combinations of lit and unlit lamps could convey information about the location of targets, the timing of planned operations, the presence of hostile surveillance, and the availability of safe houses and escape routes. For example, if Thomas needed to indicate that a group of escaped prisoners was being held in a specific building, he would create a pattern of lit lamps that pointed toward the target location, while leaving certain strategic lamps unlit to indicate the safest approach routes. If he needed to warn other operatives about increased security or surveillance, he would alter the lighting pattern in ways that would be immediately recognizable to trained observers, but would appear to be random equipment failures to anyone who didn't understand the code. The development of Thomas's lighting communication system required him to become an expert in the psychology of observation and attention. He learned that most people paid very little attention to street lighting as long as there was enough illumination to see where they were going. Small variations in lighting patterns, lamp brightness, or the timing of daily lighting routines were almost never noticed by casual observers, making it possible to embed complex coded messages in what appear to be routine maintenance activities. Thomas's first major success came in the summer of 1875, when his surveillance activities revealed the location and timing of a major prisoner transport operation that was scheduled to move over 30 captives through Millbrook during the peak of cattle season. The prisoners included former slaves who were being returned to illegal bondage, Mexican immigrants who were being transported for sale to mining operations, and several political dissidents who had been kidnapped from their homes in other territories. The rescue operation that Thomas coordinated was a masterpiece of planning and execution that demonstrated the effectiveness of his lighting communication system. Over a period of 2 weeks, he used various lighting patterns to convey detailed information about guard schedules, prisoner locations, security weaknesses, and optimal timing for rescue operations. He coordinated the activities of over 20 operatives who were positioned throughout Millbrook, ensuring that everyone involved understood their roles and timing without ever meeting face-to-face or exchanging written communications. The actual rescue took place on a moonless night when Thomas's lighting patterns guided rescue operatives to the exact locations where prisoners were being held. Simultaneously, other operatives used his signals to identify and neutralize guards, secure escape routes, and coordinate transportation to safe houses throughout the territory. The entire operation was completed in less than 4 hours, with all 30 prisoners successfully rescued and the criminal transport network completely disrupted. But the success of the rescue operation also marked the beginning of Thomas's most dangerous period in Millbrook. The criminal network realized that their activities were being monitored by someone with sophisticated intelligence capabilities, and they began conducting counter-surveillance operations designed to identify and eliminate whoever was responsible for their losses. The investigation that followed the failed prisoner transport operation was conducted by professional investigators who had been hired by the criminal network to identify security breaches and eliminate threats to their operations. These investigators understood that the rescue operation had required detailed advance intelligence about their activities, sophisticated coordination capabilities, and access to resources that suggested involvement by organized opposition rather than random interference. Thomas's challenge was to continue his intelligence gathering and communication activities while avoiding detection by investigators who were specifically looking for signs of organized surveillance and covert operations. This required him to develop even more sophisticated techniques for concealing his real activities while maintaining his cover as a simple lamplighter whose only concerns were keeping the street lights functioning properly. The solution that Thomas developed was to create multiple layers of deception that would mislead investigators even if they suspected his involvement in resistance activities. He began deliberately creating obvious mistakes and inconsistencies in his lamp lighting routines that would make him appear incompetent and unreliable rather than suspicious. He cultivated a reputation for being absent-minded and prone to equipment failures, characteristics that would explain any unusual lighting patterns without suggesting intentional communication activities. Most importantly, Thomas began using his lighting communication system to conduct false flag operations that would mislead criminal investigators about the nature and capabilities of the opposition they were facing. He created lighting patterns that suggested the involvement of much larger numbers of operatives than were actually working in the area, operations that were being conducted from different locations than were actually being used, and capabilities that were either much greater or much less than what his network actually possessed. These deception operations were successful in confusing and misdirecting the criminal network's security investigations, but they also attracted unwanted attention from territorial authorities who became concerned about the apparent presence of sophisticated criminal or insurgent activities in their jurisdiction. Thomas found himself caught between criminal investigators who suspected his involvement in resistance activities and government officials who were beginning to investigate the same activities from a law enforcement perspective. The crisis that nearly ended Thomas's mission came when territorial authorities decided to conduct a comprehensive investigation of all unusual activities in Millbrook, including irregularities in municipal services like street lighting. Government investigators began monitoring Thomas's daily routines, documenting his lighting patterns, and analyzing any deviations from standard procedures to determine whether they represented security threats or criminal communications. Thomas's response to government surveillance demonstrated both his operational skills and his commitment to protecting the people he had been helping. Rather than fleeing or abandoning his mission, he chose to use his position to feed false information to government investigators while continuing to operate his rescue and communication networks through alternative methods that would be invisible to official surveillance. The alternative communication system that Thomas developed relied on methods that were completely separate from the street lighting network, but equally effective for coordinating rescue operations. He began using variations in his daily maintenance routines, changes in the locations where he stored equipment, and alterations in his walking patterns to convey coded information to network operatives who understood how to interpret these subtle signals. For example, if Thomas needed to indicate that a rescue operation was scheduled for a specific night, he would place his equipment ladder in a particular location during his morning rounds. If he needed to warn operatives about increased security, he would vary his walking route in ways that would be meaningful to trained observers but would appear to be random efficiency improvements to anyone conducting surveillance. These alternative communication methods proved to be even more secure than the original lighting patterns because they were based on activities that were completely normal and expected parts of Thomas's legitimate job responsibilities. Government investigators who were looking for suspicious lighting patterns found nothing unusual, while network operatives who understood the real communication system continued to receive detailed intelligence and coordination information. Thomas's success in maintaining his operations under intense government surveillance led to his assignment to an even more dangerous mission: the investigation and disruption of corruption within the territorial government itself. Evidence had emerged suggesting that some of the criminal networks he had been fighting were actually connected to corrupt territorial officials who were using their positions to protect illegal operations and profit from criminal activities. The investigation of government corruption required Thomas to develop entirely new operational techniques because his targets now included people with access to official surveillance capabilities, law enforcement resources, and political influence that could be used to eliminate threats to their activities. The criminals he had been fighting previously were dangerous, but operated outside the legal system. Corrupt officials represented a much more sophisticated threat because they could use legitimate government authority to destroy anyone who threatened their illegal enterprises. Thomas's approach to investigating government corruption demonstrated his understanding that different types of enemies required different strategies. Instead of using his lighting communication system to coordinate direct action operations like rescues and raids, he began using it to orchestrate sophisticated intelligence collection activities that would document corrupt activities and create evidence that could be used to expose and prosecute corrupt officials through legitimate legal channels. The intelligence collection operation that Thomas conducted over the next 18 months was one of the most comprehensive anti-corruption investigations in frontier history. Using his network of operatives and his lighting communication system, he documented connections between territorial officials and criminal networks, financial relationships that proved corrupt payments and profit sharing, and specific instances of official misconduct that violated federal law and territorial regulations. The evidence that Thomas collected included photographs of meetings between officials and known criminals, copies of financial documents that proved illegal payments, testimony from witnesses who had observed corrupt activities, and detailed records of government decisions that had been made to benefit criminal enterprises rather than serve legitimate public interests. Most importantly, Thomas's investigation revealed that the prisoner transport network he had been fighting was actually part of a much larger criminal enterprise that included illegal mining operations, land fraud schemes, election manipulation, and systematic extortion of legitimate businesses. The corrupt territorial officials were not just protecting criminal activities. They were actively participating in and profiting from a comprehensive criminal organization that had essentially captured control of territorial government in several counties. The decision to expose the government corruption network required Thomas to abandon his cover identity and reveal the existence of his intelligence network to federal authorities who had the jurisdiction and resources necessary to prosecute territorial officials for federal crimes. This was an extremely dangerous decision because it would make him a target for elimination by powerful people who had unlimited access to both criminal and official resources. Thomas's method for exposing the corruption network was as ingenious as his intelligence collection had been thorough. Rather than simply turning his evidence over to federal authorities who might be compromised or intimidated, he chose to simultaneously release information to multiple news organizations, federal agencies, and political figures who had the motivation and capability to act on the revelations without being influenced by the corrupt officials who were being exposed. The lighting communication system played a crucial role in coordinating this complex information release operation. Thomas used his network to ensure that evidence was delivered to multiple recipients simultaneously, preventing any single authority from suppressing the information or eliminating key witnesses before the story became public knowledge. The coordination required was extraordinarily complex, involving dozens of operatives in multiple territories and precise timing to ensure maximum impact and minimal opportunity for retaliation. The revelation of the government corruption network created a political sensation that extended far beyond Colorado territory and led to federal investigations, congressional hearings, and criminal prosecutions that reached all the way to Washington, D.C. The evidence that Thomas's network had collected was so comprehensive and convincing that it resulted in the removal of numerous territorial officials, the dismantling of criminal organizations that had operated with government protection, and fundamental reforms in territorial administration that made similar corruption much more difficult in the future. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Thomas's legacy was not the specific criminals and corrupt officials who were brought to justice, but the demonstration that ordinary citizens with extraordinary dedication could create effective opposition to organized corruption and criminal activity, even when official law enforcement was compromised or inadequate. The lighting communication system that Thomas had developed became a model for covert operations throughout the American frontier and beyond. The techniques he had created for using civilian infrastructure for military communication purposes were studied and adapted by intelligence operatives working in various conflicts and situations where conventional communication methods were unavailable or compromised. More importantly, Thomas's story illustrated the principle that effective resistance to injustice and corruption requires not just courage and commitment, but also intelligence, creativity, and the ability to work within existing systems while fundamentally changing their purpose and impact. His street lamps had provided light to the community, but they had also provided something much more valuable: hope for people who had been abandoned by conventional law enforcement and government protection. In the end, Thomas Brennan's true illumination had not been the oil flames that lit Millbrook streets, but the light of justice that his secret communications had brought to people who had been living in the darkness of oppression and exploitation. His patterns of light and shadow had guided not just escaped prisoners to freedom, but entire communities toward a better understanding of what justice could accomplish when ordinary people were willing to risk everything to protect others. The lamplighter who had brought darkness instead of light had actually brought the brightest illumination of all: the recognition that even in the most lawless and corrupt environments, individual courage and ingenuity could create networks of hope that would eventually overcome any amount of organized evil, proving that sometimes the most important light comes not from flames, but from a human spirit's refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. If you enjoyed this incredible true story of courage triumphing over corruption, subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things in the American frontier. In the comments below, let us know what you think about Thomas's methods. Was he right to use deception and secret communications to fight corruption, or should he have worked within the legal system? Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking story of hidden heroism from the untamed West.